We're still trying, boys. We're still trying. You know, there's books out there that tell you how to bring children up, but there's no books that tell you how to live without them. Never did I think that you would actually get away with murder.
All of a sudden, a lot of emergency vehicles. There was fire engines, police cars, ambulances.
What happened here last night destroyed lives. A father, Darren Sykes, was at home with his 2 sons when a blaze took hold of the property.
Shock, absolute shock. You know, we knew Darren very well.
He was like a big boy, playing with the kids, like, you know.
It's clearly a tragic incident, and our hearts go out to the family.
I was just driving to work and I just got this awful feeling.
And things kept coming out that staggered even the police.
There's a technique called gaslighting, and essentially they try and convince their victim that they are going mad.
What she was describing was someone totally different to the person that we'd got to know.
It's the fact that, you know, the dad would do that to his own children. I think they found that hard.
It's terrible. It's enough to break anybody.
I think it's one of the most harrowing stories I've ever had to cover.
It was the 19th of October. I worked for Carpet World and they were doing a store opening at Wakefield. And when they do a store opening, they always ask for extra salesmen, so he was a salesman.
In 1996, 24-year-old Claire Throssell was working as a shop assistant when she first met 25-year-old Darren Sykes.
Wasn't really impressed with him. Typical sales rep, full of the patter. And he asked me out on the Sunday and I said no. And then for 3 weeks after that, he sent a rose to my work every day and he kept saying on a note, I will keep sending these roses until you actually go out with me. And after 3 weeks I said yes, and we went to a pub and it went from there. It moved very quickly.
In the early days of their relationship, Darren showered Claire with compliments and attention.
He'd pull a chair out, he'd hold my coat. He treated me like a lady. He used to call me a princess. My family and friends thought he was great. They thought he absolutely adored me.
Claire and Darren married in 1998. And 4 years later, in March 2002, their first child was born.
When Jack came along, it's that feeling of instant love. Jack, he was such a lovely, gentle boy. And he had a smile that, you know, would make the sun look dull.
In 2005, the couple had their second son.
Paul was cheeky, he was out there. His whole demeanour was speed. He went training 3 days a week at a running track, and he'd say to me, whatever's going on at home, Mum, on this track I'm free, I'm flying. But even though they were very different, we had the same bond, and that was really important.
But while Claire formed a strong connection with both boys, their relationship with their father was very different.
The boys never had a bond with their dad. He never changed a nappy, he never did a night feed. He wanted everything his way. If the boys wanted to do something, if he didn't want to do it, then they didn't get to do it.
By 2008, Jack and Paul were aged 6 and 3, and the family were living in Tennyson Close in South Yorkshire. And to many of their friends, they seemed like any other family.
We met Claire and Darren as parents at the school because both their children were also at the same school.
Our children had the same sort of interests. We shared, take turns to give lifts to the band and everything.
Darren and I, we got on really well. It was really nice to get to know them. They were, one of the first couples that we got to know when we moved into the area.
But as Jack and Paul got older, Claire began to notice a change in her once doting husband's behaviour.
I can't pinpoint a day when it started because it was so subtle. I think the first time was a punch on the arm on New Year's Eve. And then get ready to go out somewhere and they say, "Oh, are you wearing that? Didn't think you'd be wearing that. I thought you'd be wearing what I bought you." And then he'd move my car keys. And even though he knew I was late for work, he wouldn't put the keys back for another hour or so. And then when he was going to work, he'd put my keys back where they were and he'd say, "Look, they were there all the time." And you're like, were they? Is it me? Am I going mad?
There's a technique called gaslighting that people like Sykes use on their victims, and essentially they try and convince their victim that they are going mad. Gaslighting is very much a way of gradually maintaining control over somebody, because when that person is questioning their own sanity, they become much easier to manipulate and control.
By 2011, after nearly 13 years of marriage, Darren's occasional displays of affection began to adopt a sinister feel.
He'd ring up once a day and he'd say, "I just called to say I love you." But then that one call started to turn into 5 calls, and it turned into 20 calls. Then it turned into 40 calls a day. But if I didn't answer the phone, it would just keep ringing and ringing and ringing. And then you get the questions, why didn't you answer your phone? What were you doing? You should have answered your phone. And what started out as really caring, i.e. saying, "Oh, we'll have a joint bank account because what's mine is yours," turns into a weapon. "You can't go out with your friends today, we haven't got the money."
Controlling behaviour is drip, drip, drip. It's little bit by little bit by little bit. So people like Sykes do not present as abusive or controlling in the beginning of a relationship, but they start to just sprinkle things into the relationship so that they increase their control over time. And they will introduce control under the guise of care and concern.
It got to a point where I really did feel like a piece of dirt underneath, not just his shoe, but the whole world's shoe. No more princess, no more "I love you." None of that had all disappeared.
Looking back, he was always someone who wanted to control everything. And Claire would say, "Oh, I'm going to do this afternoon to go and see someone else." And Darren would prevent that by saying, "Yeah, but I needed the car." But the strange thing was that he had a company car. So it's purely to restrict Claire, what she could do and where she could go.
As well as targeting Claire, Darren's abusive behaviour was now being directed at his 2 young sons.
He had a bad temper with Jack and Paul. If they didn't eat the meals, they'd be forced to sit there and eat the meals. He'd assaulted Paul. He'd just got 2 pieces of toast and he didn't want the crust. And for that, he got pulled by his collar back to the table and slammed into the chair. And he pushed him that hard into the chair, he nearly fell off the chair. I just tried to make sure they ate before he came home.
People who are the victims of domestic abuse learn to adapt their behaviour as not to irritate or anger the perpetrator. And they're doing this in a way to keep themselves safe. So when you see somebody staying in a relationship that's abusive, this is very often a safety tactic because they know that if they were to leave that relationship, that would escalate the risk.
By April 2014, when Jack was 12 and Paul was 9, Claire began to finally contemplate a life without her abusive husband.
I'd been thinking of leaving for a long time, but the penultimate act, we were at the top of the stairs and Jack at 12 was being flippant and he said, "Have you done your homework?" And he said, "I've told you I've done my homework." And he just got his fist and he went for him. But where his fist was, would have been Jack's face. So without thinking, I just pushed Jack into his bedroom, shut the door, and took the punch on my arm. I spun around and landed at the bottom of the stairs. And he stood at the top of the stairs and he said, "Look what you made me do." And I knew that day, when I was laid at the bottom of the stairs, that the time had come. And I just said to the boys, "We're going to Nanan's," and I said, "Run for the door," because I had this feeling that he'd block it. But we got out before he could, and we went to my mum's. So she said, "Right, we're going to get some beds for the boys. This is it. You've done the first step and everything will be fine." But sadly, it wasn't, and it never has been.
In April 2014, Claire Throssell left her abusive husband Darren Sykes after 16 years of marriage. She took her 2 sons, Jack, aged 12, and Paul, aged 9, and went to live at her mother's, leaving Sykes alone in the former family home.
When we'd left and we'd gone to my mum's, the boys were settled. They weren't on eggshells.
When Claire told her husband she was divorcing him after 16 years of marriage, Sykes began a campaign of harassment against Claire.
He was ringing me and stalking me, slashed my tyres, threw my clothes on my mum's front lawn. The intimidation to me ramped up, and I had to shield the boys from that. I couldn't show them the texts, I couldn't show them the phone calls.
During this time, the couple's friends Andy and Kay felt torn between what and who to believe.
There's always 2 sides to every story, and Claire was giving us some suggestion as what was going on. It sounds bad at the time. There was a period when we just really didn't know who to believe. What she was describing was someone totally different to the person that we'd got to know as well.
He'd pick the boys up early, he'd drop them off late, and he pushed and pushed and pushed these boundaries. My mum's property was flagged with the police as a high risk for domestic abuse because he'd been on the property and caused problems.
When Claire leaves Sykes, he wants to get control back because he sees it that she's taken control away from him. So he engages in this campaign of harassment and stalking and criminal damage. He vandalises her car. He really does make life incredibly difficult for her. So at this point, he is seeking retribution, and that is how he's going to get control back.
Despite Claire's attempt to shield them, Sykes' campaign of harassment began to have an effect on Jack and Paul.
Paul had a breakdown at school at the thought of having to see his dad. So I applied for an emergency residency order. Social services got involved and said, no contact. And for a little while it was great because I could talk to my solicitor. They could do all the normal things, and at school they said how happy they were that they didn't have to see their dad anymore. I had this side of knowing that the boys were finally happy.
Here we go then.
3.
Oh my God! Yeah,
Woo!
Jesus Christ! Jesus, how was that big?
And then I broke it to them that they might have to see their dad. And they were devastated because they thought all the fear had gone. And I never lied to either of them. And I said, there's a real possibility that you'll have to see your dad on a regular basis.
In July 2014, Claire and Darren Sykes attended a child arrangement hearing to determine Sykes' future contact arrangements with Jack and Paul.
I'd written in my court application that he was capable of seriously injuring the boys because when he saw red, there was no limit, there was no line. And I told everybody, the solicitor, the court, Cafcass, social services. He got a warning for assaulting the neighbour. He admitted that he'd assaulted Paul. If Paul had been an adult, he'd have been able to take him to court and have him prosecuted. But because he was 9 years old, his voice wasn't listened to. He had no voice at all.
Despite the wishes of both Claire and her 2 young sons, the court granted Sykes 5 hours a week unsupervised access to his children, forcing Jack and Paul to spend time with their dad.
From that day forward, I always had a fist of fear in my stomach whenever they went for a visit. We set up a system with the police because we thought I might be murdered or injured, that we had a code word. And that code word was extended to the boys, so if they felt like they were in danger, they'd type the code word, they knew how to do it, how to send it, and that would come to me and I'd flag it up straight with the police.
One of the things that Claire had expressed is that the children weren't comfortable going around to see him. I know on one instance he'd hidden a camera and he said, oh, I've got proof of how happy I am when they come round here. And he'd hidden the camera in between like the cushions of the sofa to film them as they came into the house. He just showed me the film and just said, look, does this look like unhappy children to you? Because they're happy to come here and they're happy to see me. And I just said, well, if the children are happy, you should rely on them being able to say they're happy to do so, not for you to have to secretly film them.
In early October 2014, Claire and Darren's divorce was finalised. 2 weeks later, on Wednesday, October 22nd, Sykes collected Jack and Paul for his weekly 5-hour contact visit.
It started out just like any other day. I took Jack and Paul to school, and as normal, I'd just jump out of the car and run down the driveway into school.
Claire went to work as usual. At around 6 p.m, Jack and Paul were collected by Sykes from Claire's mother's home. Claire returned from work just minutes later.
I literally got home and I'd missed them by 5 minutes. But for some reason, their phones was on the table. Instantly, you get that feeling in your stomach. And you know what? I wanted to go and take them the phones. And if I'd have gone and taken them the phones instead of having my tea, then maybe I could have stopped what happened next. I just literally finished my tea at 6:30, and 5 minutes later there was a knock on the door. And instantly I felt dread. And I didn't want to answer the door. And as I opened the door, there was a policeman stood on the doorstep.
At 6:30 p.m, freelance journalist and Penistone resident Michelle Rawlings was having a drink with her husband in a local pub.
I was actually in the White Hart pub, which is almost opposite the entrance into the cul-de-sac where Claire's marital family home was. And there was all of a sudden a lot of emergency vehicles. There was fire engines, police cars, ambulances. And both my husband and I said, that's got to be a house fire and it's got to be a big one.
The policeman said, there's been a fire. You need to come with me now. The boys have been taken to Sheffield Children's Hospital. Jack's talking, but Paul's really ill.
News of the fire quickly spread through the local community.
There's quite a lot of mums on the estate were texting each other saying, have you heard there'd been a fire? And it was Jack and Paul's house.
I was away at the time with work. That's when I saw the news. Fire in Penistone. And then there's the realisation that it was Claire and Darren's house. I couldn't believe it.
I got in the car and it must have been about 100 miles an hour that he went. And all the time this feeling was building. And I said, how poorly is my boy? How poorly is he? And he said, I don't know. I don't know.
Claire was taken to Sheffield Children's Hospital, where medics had already started treating her sons Jack and Paul. Their father, Darren, was taken to another hospital nearby.
I ran through the door, and the first thing I saw was Paul, and they were doing CPR on him. His little body was just bouncing off the bed. It's not nice to see, and it's not nice to do. And a medic came running over to me, and he said, "I'm really sorry, but we're going to let him go now." And I said, Go where?" And he said, "There's nothing more we can do for him." And I was like, no, this can't be right. I just dropped him off at school 9 hours ago. How can this be possible? And I went into the resus room, and I scooped him up in my arms. I held him so tight, and my tears just wet his hair. And I rocked him, and I said, "Come on, Paul, you can't leave. Fight this, fight." And when people say to you, or they say it in a book, that the light goes out of people's eyes, you don't believe it till you see it. And suddenly these beautiful blue eyes just came grey, and it was just as if he was looking through me. And they had to prise him out of my arms.
That evening at 8 p.m, 9-year-old Paul was pronounced dead from smoke inhalation. His 12-year-old brother Jack was still fighting for his life. Later that evening in Barnsley District General Hospital, Darren Sykes also died from the effects of the fire. News of the tragedy stunned the local community.
It's just very hard to imagine as a parent, a friend, that children could be involved in such an awful fire. At this point as well, it was also announced that Darren had died in the fire.
Just for disbelief, really, of just like, I can't believe it's happened. How has it happened? When you're trying to explain it to your own children and you know there is no real explanation. It's just bad. It's just...
Shock, absolute shock. You know, we knew Darren very well. And, you know, and he's died, and one of his sons has died, and the other one is in hospital as far as I know.
Older brother Jack was rescued, pulled out with severe burns and smoke inhalation. The 12-year-old is now in a critical condition in hospital.
Jack was covered head to toe in bandages, and they said he's 56% burnt, and they'd had to cut his chest open so that he could breathe, and his arms, because with the burns, they were swelling.
Unlike Paul, Jack was conscious when he was pulled from the burning house and managed to communicate with doctors before he was sedated.
The consultant told me that Jack had said to him, "My dad did this and he did it on purpose." And I realised in that moment that he'd only done what he'd done to punish me.
On October 22nd, 2014, 44-year-old Darren Sykes and his 9-year-old son Paul died after being pulled from a burning house by firefighters. Sykes' other son Jack was still alive, despite suffering serious injuries. Friends and neighbours were shocked by the news.
It's clearly a tragic incident, and our hearts go out to the family.
He was like a big boy, playing with the kids, like, you know. He was always playing with them and laughing and that. He loved the kids, huh?
We just thought it was like, you know, the worst sort of accident. And the focus then was just coming to terms with the loss of Paul and Darren.
Obviously, we knew that Darren and Paul had died. And I was just driving to work, and I'd just got this awful feeling. It was just in the back of my mind. I just thought, I just hope it's an accident. But there was just like a thing in the back of my head thinking, has he done this?
Firefighters that first attended this from Penistone clearly live and work within the local community and acted very professionally under very harrowing circumstances, which was confronted by a very well-developed fire.
The fire is being treated as suspicious, but South Yorkshire Police say they're not looking for anyone else in connection with the incident.
And then police started getting in contact and then saying it was arson. It had been done deliberately.
Barnsley Hospital fought to keep my ex-husband alive so he could face justice, but they couldn't keep him alive, and I don't know how the hospital continued to fight for him, knowing what he'd done. I guess they wanted justice as much as I did.
As news filtered through that the fire was started deliberately, the local community struggled to process the shocking revelations.
We never believed he was capable of doing anything like that at all.
I live in the area, and as a journalist I've written about awful events where parents have killed their children, but when it's something so close to home and you think about those two little boys, it's horrifying. It makes you feel sick. You can't believe something like that has really happened.
Just for disbelief. There's no real explanation. I went down with some flowers to put flowers down by the house. But it's something I never thought I'd ever have to do. It's with my children, to try and explain to them why a friend of theirs has been killed and killed in that manner.
Jack had been transferred to a specialist burns unit in Manchester and was prepped for immediate surgery.
There was 14 anaesthetists in that room, and they all had their backs to me, and they were arguing in front of me about how they could keep Jack alive. And I watched him go into theatre, and all I thought was, just hold on, Jack, just hold on.
Doctors battled to save Jack's life, but after his third operation, he took a turn for the worse.
I had to sit and watch this clock, and every hour that went, I'd say to somebody, he's still alive. My boy's still alive. And then a nurse came running down the corridor, and she got this look on her face, and I went, no, 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 no. And I went into the room, and I saw the medics doing CPR on Jack, and I just collapsed into the chair, and I said, no, no, not again. After 40 minutes, they declared that they couldn't do any more. And it's strange, you get used to the sound of a heartbeat on a monitor, and when it goes into a flat line and this one tone comes out, it's almost echoing what you feel in your heart. As I held him, the room went silent, because now my heart was totally smashed, and he took the other half of my heart and soul.
In the following days, police began piecing together Sykes's last known movements. They discovered a few days before the fire, Sykes had attended a meeting with the Children and Family Court Advisory and Support Service to assess his capability as a parent.
On the Monday, the 20th of October, 2 days before the house fire, when he had his interview with the Cafcass worker. And when she terminated the interview because it wasn't going well, he wasn't listening to what she said, he barricaded her in her office and wouldn't let her leave. Now, at that point, she had the power to stop contact, and yet they ignored that, and they let that contact visit go ahead 2 days later. When he left the Cafcass office, he was picked up on CCTV cameras buying 5 billy cans of fuel, of petrol.
On the day of the fire, mobile phone records show Sykes texted his 2 sons, telling them he had a surprise for them.
For years he'd been saying he was going to set up a train set in the attic. Paul loved trains. When he was a baby, it was all Thomas. He knew every engine, he knew every number. And Jack liked the mechanics. And on the day of the fire, he'd sent messages to the boys on their phones that said, "I've got a new train, it just needs 2 drivers." And he'd messaged the boys 2 or 3 times that day to make sure they were going that night, to make sure that they'd go. And he'd even put a bowl of sweets up in the attic, so when they went in, they went straight up. They had no idea what was to come next.
Sykes potentially spent months planning these murders, and it's incredibly revealing about his personality when we look at the details of it. So here's somebody who made a series of decisions. It wasn't just one decision, and he made a series of choices over the course of these months. At any point in time, he could have decided not to do this, not to go through with it. But here's somebody who doesn't have any remorse, any empathy, any real attachment to his own children. It's all about seeking revenge and retribution.
After enticing his 2 sons into the attic, Sykes barricaded all entrances, then doused the house in petrol.
He'd locked the front door and put a chair against the door. He'd put a mattress in the middle where the kitchen and the dining room was. He'd also put a bike lock across the patio doors. That was all, not just to stop the firemen coming in, but the police told me he'd done that so the boys couldn't get out.
Sykes then started 14 separate fires in his home.
And I think, did he taunt them? Did he tell them they were going to die?
At around 6:30 p.m, emergency services were called to the property.
They didn't know they were in the attic. They had to look for them. Then they saw Paul's arm dangling through the hatch, and they knew that he was there.
Sykes was found cowering in a corner, while Jack was lying badly burnt on the landing, having fallen through the door while trying to escape.
When Paul had been overcome by the smoke and the darkness in the attic, Jack had gone back for his brother, and he reached out his hand in the darkness and he took Paul's hand and he pulled him to the edge of the attic, but he fell backwards through the hatch into the flames below, and that's how he got so horrifically burnt. He was allowed to do that because he was given unsupervised access. He was allowed to do that because a court order said he had to see them 5 hours a week. He didn't need 5 hours to do what he did. It took just 15 minutes.
As more details began to emerge, it became clear Sykes had carefully planned yet more punishment for Claire.
And things kept coming out that staggered even the police.
I remember sitting with Claire in her mum's house when she explained to me that Darren had cancelled the home and contents insurance for the house, so there was no insurance to recover, to rebuild the house, leaving Claire responsible for the house. He'd written to the mortgage company saying he would no longer be responsible for the mortgage.
How he'd planned everything, how he did everything to stop the house insurance, stop the mortgage payments, and just leave Claire in that situation afterwards. I mean, if it wasn't bad enough losing your children, it's to lose everything else that was then in your life at the time. It was just unbelievable, really. The malice and the thought that he went through to do that. Something I don't think anyone will ever understand, truly.
Just days before the fire, Sykes was seen leaving the house, holding a number of letters.
He sent letters to lots of people. He sent a letter to his parents blaming them for not being good parents, and He sent letters to his friends saying, woe is me, I can't see my children, so I'm taking them away. Every letter he sent was vindictive and aimed to hurt. He'd written letters blaming everybody else that had been sent out, including to me.
In writing these letters, Sykes was trying to present an image of himself as this father who is essentially killing his children in an altruistic way. He's somebody who is heartbroken at the fact that he's lost access to them. He's somebody who we should feel sorry for and we should sympathise with. So it's his attempt to control the story, to control the narrative.
The letter to me was cryptic. It was about a car and it's fine, but if you've got an empty car that's driving with no direction, then there's no point being around anymore. He was sorry that it had ended this way, but at least the boys were with him now.
Claire Throstle's sons, Jack and Paul, were buried on November 14th, 2014. Their gravestones simply stated their first names, so there was no association with their father.
I couldn't have a ceremony for the boys straight away. They had to have post-mortems. And I wanted to see Jack. I took the decision to see him. I knew he wouldn't look like Jack, but I wanted to hold him one last time without his tubes, without his bandages. And I said that I wanted everybody to wear colour. So I put my hand on both of them and I stood between them. They just put a little plaque on both coffins and I laid my hand flat on both of them. And I'd have stayed there all night. I would not have moved.
Many of Jack and Paul's school friends were at the funeral, struggling to come to terms with the tragic scenes.
They just found it really hard to comprehend that, you know, Darren had done this. Because, I mean, they knew Darren as, you know, well, Jack and Paul's dad, but, you know, the fact that, you know, a dad would do that to his own children, I think they found that hard.
I've covered lots of cases as a journalist for over 25 years, so I've dealt with lots of very sad events where parents have lost children, but when you discover that the children have been killed by their other parent, I don't think it can get any worse than that. I think it's one of the most harrowing stories I've ever had to cover.
There was a ring around the church, 3 deep, firefighters, mums and dads, and they were all linked. They were either holding hands, some men had their arms around each other, some had linked just by elbows, but they were all joined together. And that ring only broke to let the boys be carried into the church. Coming back to my mum's, to an empty house, I thought, this is the future. This is what I have to get used to.
Although Sykes had tried to ensure Claire was left with nothing, the people of Penistone stepped in.
The community in Penistone rallied when it was revealed that the insurance wouldn't pay for the fire damage. Fundraising began, and now the boy's mother, Claire Throstle, has enough money to begin repair work so the house can eventually be sold.
She wanted to stay in the local community. So yeah, they were brilliant. Yeah, it brings out the best in people. You know, a horrible tragedy.
There isn't enough words to say thank you, but yeah, I really appreciate what they've done and the support that they've given. And as I say, the amazing people that I've met on the way. I wish they could have met my boys because they were such wonderful boys.
It's terrible. It's enough to break anybody. But for what she's gone through would have destroyed a lot of people. They wouldn't come back from it.
Despite such a devastating loss, Claire found the strength to carry on, driven by a desire to change the law, to protect children from abusive parents.
There's a big voice for parental rights, but there's a deafening silence when it comes to children's rights.
So at the moment, Claire is still fighting the House of Lords over what is called presumption of contact. So in Claire's case, this would have been Darren would still have contact with his children, despite the fact there could have been abuse in the family home.
We could name 8 pieces of legislation that protects children in schools, colleges, nursery settings, and absolutely none that protects them in the home. Contact should only be allowed if it's in the best interest of the child and it's safe to do so.
When we try and get inside the mind of people like Sykes, we need to remember that the way that we look at children and think about children is not the same way that Sykes does. Sykes sees them as things that he owns, his possessions. And although he'd crafted quite a convincing narrative around wanting access to them because he loved them and he was their father and wanted to spend time with them, all of this was just a sideshow to essentially get to what he wanted, which was complete retribution and revenge on Claire.
In 2020, Claire was awarded an MBE for her work campaigning for victims of domestic abuse.
It doesn't feel like winning when you couldn't protect your own children, but to receive an MBE when there's so many rewarding people in the country that don't have one, it was an honour, and it will always be dedicated to Jack and Paul. And receiving awards like this, it makes you feel like you have to keep on fighting. There's something inside that says, this job isn't finished yet. I still haven't fulfilled that promise to both of them, let alone all the other children that have been let down. And I'll keep on fighting until I can go to their grave and say, we've done it.
Claire believes Jack and Paul never had a voice. Their thoughts weren't taken into consideration when Darren was given access to the children. Both the boys had said to Claire several times, we don't want to go and see him, Mum. We don't like it. We want to stay with you.
I'm keeping going to build a legacy for those 2 boys. They deserve it for who they were, and they were the best part of me. I now go into schools and colleges to educate children 14 plus on relationships, because I believe they are the future. And if I can break down the myths and break down the straplines such as gaslighting and love bombing into terms that they understand, then gradually, just like a vaccination, hopefully domestic abuse will start to be driven out for good.